The shells came without warning. One moment the hillside was trembling with the low, mechanical groan of artillery being repositioned, and the next the air itself split open, a concussive wave that knocked two men off their feet and sent a cascade of loose rock and broken timber sliding down the slope toward the supply depot. The smoke was everywhere, black and orange and white, layered in columns that rose and collapsed and rose again above the ruined ridgeline, where the ancient stones of the abbey had long since become indistinguishable from the shattered bones of the earth beneath them. Men were shouting, men were running, and somewhere in that choking, thunderous chaos between the overturned lorry and the first gun emplacement, a shape appeared that did not belong to any soldier, to any vehicle, to any piece of military machinery that had ever been catalogued or commissioned or trained for war. It rose on its hind legs. It was massive, broader than a man at the shoulders, heavy with muscle, with a jaw that could crush bone and paws that could tear steel. For one impossible second, the men near the ammunition line froze, not from fear of the German paratroops above them, not from the roar of the 25-pounder howitzers just 50 meters away, but because of this creature, calm as a shadow, standing upright among the crates of artillery shells, looking at the carnage around it with dark, unhurried eyes. Then it reached down, gripped one of the crates. 45 kilograms of live ordnance, a weight that would have broken most men's backs, and walked forward with it, steady and deliberate, toward the guns. His name was Wojtek. He was a bear, and this was the Battle of Monte Cassino. You need to understand something about despair before you can understand this story. Not the ordinary despair of a hard day or a broken plan. The despair of men who have lost everything, their country, their families, their homes, their future, and who have been told again and again by every force of history and politics and brute military power that they do not matter. The Polish soldiers of the Second Corps were not ordinary men in any sense. They had already survived things that should not have been survivable. Many of them had been arrested by the Soviet NKVD when the Red Army invaded eastern Poland in September 1939, barely 3 weeks after the Germans struck from the west. They had spent years in Soviet prison camps, in the frozen labor colonies of Siberia and Kazakhstan, in conditions of cold and starvation that killed tens of thousands of their countrymen. They had watched friends die of typhus and dysentery and simple cold. They had eaten things that no person should eat, and they had kept themselves alive through a force of will that cannot be described from the outside. It can only be recognized as the raw refusal to give the world the satisfaction of their death. When the Soviet Union and the Western Allies became partners in 1941, following the German invasion of Russia, a deal was struck. Polish prisoners would be released and reformed into an army under General Władysław Anders, and they would fight for the Allied cause. Nearly 80,000 of them streamed south out of the Soviet Union, across Iran, across the Middle East. They were skeletal, they were sick, they were furious. They were, by any reasonable military assessment, in no condition to form an effective fighting force. And yet they did, because they had something to fight for that went beyond tactics or strategy or the shifting geometry of Allied objectives. They were fighting for a Poland that existed at that point only in their hearts, a country that had been erased from the map once by the Soviets and once by the Germans, and that they would rebuild with their own hands and their own blood if it was the last thing any of them ever did. These were the men among whom a small, orphaned bear cub came to live in the spring of 1942, and it changed all of them in ways that neither they nor anyone else could have predicted. The moment of acquisition was, by all accounts, absurdly unplanned. The column was moving through the mountains near Hamadan, in western Iran, having just crossed out of the Soviet Union with the battered remnants of Anders's army. The soldiers were tired. They were malnourished. They were adjusting, with enormous psychological difficulty, to the fact that they were no longer prisoners, that the world around them had temperature and color, and the smell of things other than unwashed bodies and rotting wood. Somewhere along that mountain road, a group of them encountered a local boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, who was holding something wrapped in cloth against his chest. It was small. It was warm. It had dark eyes and a nose that twitched. The boy had found it somewhere in the mountains. Its mother had been shot, the story went, probably by hunters or by soldiers, and the cub had been surviving on whatever scraps the child could gather for it. One of the Polish soldiers produced a tin of canned meat from his pack, a significant sacrifice given how little any of them had, and offered it in exchange. The boy accepted. The cub changed hands. And with that transaction, quiet and unremarked and utterly without ceremony, one of the most improbable military careers in the history of the Second World War began. The soldiers named him Wojtek, a diminutive Polish name that translated roughly means something like joyful warrior or smiling fighter. It was a name chosen half in jest, the way soldiers in extremity often name things in jest, as a defense against taking any single thing too seriously. They could not have known how perfectly it would fit. He was tiny at first. He fit in the crook of an arm, in the hood of a coat, against the chest under a jacket on cold nights. The soldiers fed him condensed milk from a bottle, which he gripped with both forepaws and drank from with an intensity that delighted them. It is important to understand what this small, ridiculous, greedy, clumsy animal meant to these men. They had come from a place of absolute psychological desolation. The Soviets had not merely imprisoned them. They had attempted to erase their identities, their sense of self, their connection to anything human and warm and good. Pets, family photographs, private possessions, the small rituals of normal life, all of it had been stripped away. And now, here was this creature, utterly dependent, utterly without agenda, who wanted nothing more complicated from them than food and warmth and the proximity of their bodies. The effect was electric. Men who had not properly laughed in years laughed at the cub's stumbling, attempts to walk. Men who had been unable to sleep without nightmares slept soundly with the small, warm weight of him against their sides. Something that had been locked up inside them, some essential human capacity for tenderness that the Gulag had tried very hard to kill, began, slowly and tentatively, to unlock. He grew fast. Within months he was larger than any of them had quite expected, and within a year he was enormous, a Syrian brown bear, which is a subspecies notable for its relatively pale coloring and its considerable adult size. But the relationship had been established in those first weeks of bottle feeding and shared body heat, and it did not fundamentally change just because the scale of it became more dramatic. He continued to sleep in the camp. He continued to eat whatever the men ate. He continued to demand and receive a level of personal attention and physical affection that would have seemed, to any outside observer, completely insane in a military context. But here is the thing. Military units throughout history have kept mascots, have bonded around shared symbols and shared objects of affection. What the Polish soldiers had with Wojtek was something simultaneously more practical and more profound. He was not merely a symbol. He was a participant in their daily life, a creature who pushed back, who had opinions, who sulked when ignored and celebrated when engaged, who had, in the truest sense, become one of them. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company, to which Wojtek was eventually officially attached, referred to him simply as a soldier. And they meant it not just as a legal fiction, but as a statement of identity. The question of his official status became urgent when the unit received orders to embark for Italy via a British Royal Navy transport ship. British military regulations were explicit on the subject of animals aboard naval vessels. They were not permitted. This presented the Polish officers with a problem that was, in its way, perfectly emblematic of the absurdity of war. They could move a unit of men who had survived the Gulag and walked across half of Central Asia onto a ship headed into one of the bloodiest theaters of the European war, but they could not move a bear. The solution arrived at was characteristically Polish in its combination of seriousness and dark humor. They simply made Wojtek a soldier. He was enrolled in the official military register. He was assigned a rank, private. He was given a serial number. From that moment forward, from the perspective of the British naval authorities, he was simply another member of the Polish Second Corps, indistinguishable in administrative terms from any other private, and therefore fully entitled to transport on a military vessel. It worked. Nobody asked too many questions. The paperwork was in order. Private Wojtek of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company boarded the ship without incident, and the bureaucratic machinery of war ground onward, satisfied. If you are watching this video and you have never spent time around an animal that you love, an animal that knows you, that reads your moods, that adapts to your silences and your energies, then perhaps this part of the story will seem like mere sentimentality, like soldiers projecting human qualities onto a beast that could not possibly understand them. But if you have, you know that the relationship between a human and a large, intelligent animal that has been raised from infancy in close proximity is something that cannot be fully explained away by psychology or skepticism. What Wojtek understood about his soldiers was different in nature from what they understood about him, but it was not nothing. He understood the rhythms of camp life. He understood the hierarchy. He seemed to recognize and respond differently to officers than to enlisted men, not because he had been taught to salute, but because he could read the deference in the bodies of those around him and modeled his own behavior on it. He understood that certain sounds meant danger, and certain sounds meant routine. He could distinguish between the groans of machinery and the concussion of hostile fire, with a precision that occasionally outstripped the instincts of the men around him. And he had developed, over years of living among these particular human beings, an attachment so specific and so deep that it could only be described as loyalty. The incident in Palestine, the one that became legend among the soldiers and was retold at every reunion for decades afterward, happened at a field camp somewhere in the Levant during the long months of preparation and training before Italy. A local man, an Arab civilian, had managed to get inside the perimeter of the camp, either as a spy or simply as someone seeking to pilfer supplies. The accounts vary on this point, and it probably doesn't matter. He had hidden himself in the camp's bathing facility, a makeshift shower arrangement that the soldiers used in shifts. What the man had not known, because how could he have known, was that Wojtek also used the showers, not because he had been taught to. Bears are not animals that require washing facilities, but because he had watched the soldiers, had seen what they did there, and had concluded, with the perfect imitative logic of a highly intelligent creature raised among humans, that this was simply what one did in a camp. He had adopted it as part of his routine. He walked in. He found the man. The man, confronted with an enormous, dripping adult bear in an enclosed space, did what any rational person would do. He screamed, loudly and without stopping, until the guards came. The spy, or the thief, whoever he was apprehended without a single shot being fired, without any soldier being put at risk. Wojtek received extra rations. The story spread through the entire corps within days, growing in each retelling, as such stories do, into something slightly more epic, slightly more perfectly constructed than the probably mundane reality had been. But the core of it was true. The bear had, in some meaningful sense, captured a man. It is worth pausing here to think about what the months before Monte Cassino looked like for the Polish Second Corps, because the battle itself cannot be understood without them. By early 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had ground to a near-complete halt. The Germans had established the Winter Line, a series of fortified defensive positions running east to west across the Italian boot. And at the center of the Winter Line sat the Gustav Line. And at the center of the Gustav Line sat Monte Cassino. The mountain dominated the valley below. At its summit was the Benedictine Abbey, founded in the 6th century, one of the most sacred sites in Western Christianity, and, from the perspective of military geography, one of the most advantageous defensive positions in Europe. The Germans, and specifically the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the paratroopers, arguably the finest infantry in the German order of battle, had turned the mountain into a fortress. Every approach was covered. Every fold in the ground had been sighted, zeroed, and pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire. The casualties from 3 previous Allied attempts to take the position had been catastrophic. The British and the Americans and the Anzac forces had bled themselves white on those slopes. Now it was the Poles' turn. General Anders understood perfectly what was being asked of his men. He understood that the position was nearly impregnable, that the Germans defending it were elite, that the terrain gave every possible advantage to the defense. He also understood, and this is the part that cannot be separated from the psychology of his soldiers, that for the Polish Second Corps, this was not merely a military objective. Monte Cassino was the road to Rome. Rome was the road to a liberated Italy. Italy was the road to a liberated Western Europe. And a liberated Western Europe was, however distantly and improbably, the road back to Poland. They were fighting, in the most literal geographical sense, toward home. The men knew all of this. They had been briefed, and they had discussed it among themselves in the evenings, in the camps that by now had taken on some of the quality of a permanent community, with their bear, their routines, their collective humor and collective grief. When Anders called for volunteers for the assault, knowing the casualty estimates, knowing what the slopes of that mountain had already swallowed in human lives, the entire corps volunteered. Every single man. If you understand that, you understand what Wojtek was to them. He was the living proof that tenderness could survive anything. He was the physical embodiment of the fact that they had not been broken. Every time a man looked at that bear, at the sheer improbable existence of him, fat and comfortable and demanding his share of everyone's cigarettes, it was a refutation of everything the Gulag had tried to accomplish. You cannot crush a people who still know how to love something. Before we get to the battle, there is one more thing you need to understand about what Wojtek had become to these men by the spring of 1944. The relationship had been evolving for 2 years. 2 years of shared camps, shared food, shared mornings and evenings and bad nights and good ones. 2 years of watching him grow from a trembling, milk-dependent cub into a creature of enormous physical power, who nevertheless moved through the world of the camp with a kind of gentleness that was, in context, something like grace. He had learned to march, not because anyone had forced him to, but because he had watched the men march and concluded, apparently, that this was what one did. He would fall into step beside them during drill, upright on his hind legs, matching their pace with an earnestness that reduced even the strictest sergeant majors to helpless laughter. He had learned to salute in a fashion. He would raise one forepaw when a salute seemed appropriate, having observed the gesture enough times to understand its social function, even if not its military meaning. He had learned which men carried food in their pockets and would follow those men with a focused attention that the men found either flattering or maddening, depending on the day. He had developed preferences, particular men he liked more than others, particular foods he would refuse with great dramatic ceremony if they failed to meet his standards, particular locations in any camp that he immediately claimed as his territory, and from which he could survey the entire operation with a proprietorial satisfaction that was either deeply funny or deeply appropriate, depending again on your perspective. He was, in other words, a person, not a human person, a bare person, but a person in all the ways that matter to a unit of soldiers living in close quarters under conditions of sustained stress. He had an identity, a history, a set of established relationships, a role. And the role he had grown into, without anyone designing it, was something like chaplain, something like mascot, something like anchor. When things were bad, he was still himself. When the news from Poland was bad, and the news from Poland was almost always bad, he was still demanding his ration of porridge. When the men were silent and private in their grief, he did not demand anything, but he was present, a warm weight against a side or a back, a breathing, living reminder that the world still contained warmth. He was the one thing in their lives that was entirely his own, not a military objective, not a political calculation, not a piece of the machinery of the Allied war effort. He was just Wojtek, and they would have walked through fire for him. As it turned out, he walked through it for them. The assault on Monte Cassino began in the early hours of May 12th, 1944. The artillery preparation was extraordinary. Over 1,000 guns from multiple Allied armies opened fire simultaneously, and the sound could be heard as far south as Naples. For the men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, whose job was not to assault the heights directly, but to keep the guns fed and firing, the next several days were a nightmare of logistics conducted under constant fire. The supply routes were under German observation. The German Fallschirmjäger had mortar teams that had been living on that mountain for months and who knew every depression, every gully, every approach to every Allied position, with a familiarity that could only be called intimate. The roads, such as they were, had been churned into deep mud by the spring rains and the passage of heavy vehicles. Wheeled transport could not get through. Even tracked vehicles struggled on the steeper gradients. The shells had to be moved forward by whatever means were available, and those means were, in large part, human hands and human backs. This is where the testimony of the men who were there becomes slightly dreamlike, not in the sense of being unreal, but in the sense of having the quality of something perceived through extreme exhaustion and extreme stress, where the mind records images with unusual clarity because everything might matter, because any second might be the last. They described men stumbling forward with crates of shells on their shoulders, slipping in the mud, going to their knees, getting up, going forward. They described the constant sound, not just the guns, but the crack and whine of incoming fire, the crump of mortar rounds, the occasional high mechanical scream of a Stuka, the human sounds beneath all of it that you learn quickly and permanently not to think about. They described a point, somewhere on the second or third day of the operation, when the supply line began to falter, when the men were simply too exhausted to keep the ammunition moving at the rate the guns demanded, when something was going to give way, if something else did not give way first. And then they described Wojtek. He had been in the camp area with the vehicles and the supplies, which was normal. He was not a combat animal, and there was no plan for him in the tactical scheme. He had been watching. This needs to be said carefully, because it is easy to overread the interior life of an animal in hindsight, knowing what happened next. What is documentable is this. Wojtek had been observing the men loading shells and carrying them forward. He had done this in training contexts, had watched the process dozens or hundreds of times. He had, on previous occasions, been given shells to carry as a kind of game, because he was large and strong and seemed to enjoy having a task, and because soldiers with a bear will inevitably use the bear for amusement. He knew what the crates were. He knew what carrying them looked like. And at some point, when the situation around him had reached a pitch of urgency that even a bear with no military training and no tactical briefing could not mistake, he walked to the ammunition line, stood upright, and took a crate. The soldiers who saw it first didn't know what to do. There was a half second of complete disorientation, of the kind that only happens when something occurs that is not in any category your mind has previously prepared. And then someone understood that this was real, that it was happening, that the bear was going to carry the shells, and people started moving again, and the line started moving again, and Wojtek made his first trip, and came back, and made another trip, and kept going. In the accounts of the men who were present, there is a recurring note of something very close to reverence, not toward the military utility of the bear, but toward the sheer, uncomplicated rightness of him, the way he had looked at the situation and seen what was needed and simply done it, without being asked, without being ordered, without any mechanism of duty or fear or ideology or nationalism. He did it because these were his people and they needed something done. The detail that lodged itself most permanently in the memory of the survivors was the noise. The guns were firing constantly. The shells were landing, not all of them far enough away. The air was full of the percussion of explosions, the scream of shrapnel, the roar of fire. And Wojtek did not run. Every instinct that a wild animal has, every finely tuned alarm system that millions of years of evolution had built into the nervous system of his species, was screaming at him to go, to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the source of the noise and the death and the chaos. And he didn't go. He stayed. He kept walking, back and forth with his crates, as steady as a machine and as warm as a heart, while the world exploded around him. There are several ways to interpret this. You could say it was simply habituation, that years spent among artillery pieces had, in some behavioral sense, desensitized him to the sounds that would terrify a wild animal. You could say it was the depth of his bond to the men around him, the social cohesion of his adopted pack, overwhelming the survival instinct. You could say that he did not fully understand the danger in the way a human being understands it, that his calm was simply a function of not fully knowing. All of these explanations are probably partly true, but none of them quite captures what the soldiers themselves described, which was that Wojtek's calm had a quality to it that felt active rather than passive. He was not merely failing to panic. He was present, deliberate, purposeful. He was, in every observable sense, exactly where he had chosen to be, doing exactly what he had decided to do. If you have a better word for that than courage, I would like to hear it. The Battle of Monte Cassino, the fourth and final battle for the position, ended on May 18th, 1944, when Polish soldiers, the men of the 12th Podolian Cavalry Regiment, raised a makeshift flag over the ruins of the abbey. The flag they flew was not a proper military banner. It was improvised from a soldier's handkerchief and a woman's scarf that had been carried by one of the men since the Soviet camps. There was no music. There was no ceremony. There was barely any strength left to stand. The Poles had taken the position that 3 previous Allied offensives had failed to crack, and they had taken it at a cost of nearly 900 men killed and 3,000 wounded in less than a week of fighting. The German Fallschirmjäger who had defended the position were not routed. They withdrew in good order to the next defensive line north. That is how good they were. And the Poles had broken them anyway. The commanding officer of the German paratroops, in a message to his Allied counterpart after the battle, specifically mentioned the Polish soldiers' assault, not in terms of tactics or firepower, but in terms of the quality of the men. Even enemies can recognize something extraordinary when they encounter it. Wojtek, for his part, received no official battle citation. He received instead something arguably more meaningful. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company changed its official unit insignia. The new badge showed a brown bear carrying an artillery shell on his shoulder. It is among the most unusual unit insignia in the history of any army anywhere in the world. It is also, in some way that is difficult to put into words, among the most honest, because it recorded not just what the unit had done, but who the unit had been. The war continued after Monte Cassino. The Allied armies pushed north through Italy, through the ruins of Cassino town, past the Hitler line, up the valley toward Rome, which fell on June 4th, 2 days before D-Day in Normandy. Then further north, through the brutal Gothic line, fighting in the mountains of central Italy, through the autumn and winter of 1944 into 1945. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company moved with the campaign, and Wojtek moved with them. And by now he was a fully integrated presence in the life of the unit in a way that had stopped being remarkable and had simply become part of the fabric of things. He attended unit functions. He attended, in a sense, the daily rituals of cooking and eating and storytelling and argument that constitute the real substance of military life, the part that doesn't appear in the histories, but that the men who lived it remember as clearly as any battle. He drank beer when given the opportunity, which was often. He smoked cigarettes, not out of nicotine addiction, presumably, but because he associated the act with the men he lived among and wanted to perform the same rituals. He wrestled. He was not always gentle in his wrestling, and the men who engaged him had to be careful, but they continued to engage him, because the joy of wrestling with an animal that large and that strong is apparently a joy that overrides the associated risks. He climbed trees. He intimidated visitors to the camp by simply existing at a scale that visitors to the camp were not prepared for. He was, by any measure, a very good soldier, present, reliable, loyal, possessed of unusual physical courage, and capable of generating an enthusiasm in his unit that no amount of official propaganda or morale management could have manufactured. There is a photograph taken somewhere in Italy in 1944 that has become one of the most reproduced images associated with the Polish Second Corps. It shows Wojtek standing upright beside a group of soldiers, his head roughly level with the tallest man's shoulder, his expression, insofar as a bear has expressions that a human being can read, one of absolute composure. The men around him are grinning, not the polished smiles of official military photography, but the real thing, the kind of grin that arrives on a face without permission. They look like what they were, a group of people who had been through something terrible together and were, in this moment, happy. That photograph contains more truth about the Polish Second Corps than any official history I have ever read. There is something that needs to be said here about what men keep from war, because the story of Wojtek is in part a story about memory and what it means to survive. The Polish soldiers of the Second Corps came home eventually to a world that was nothing like the one they had left. Poland, the country they had fought to liberate, had been handed by the Western Allies to the Soviet sphere at the conferences of Tehran and Yalta, a political arrangement that many of the soldiers regarded, with considerable justification, as a betrayal. The men who had left Soviet prison camps to fight for the Allies were told, in effect, that the country they had been fighting toward would now be governed by a Soviet-backed government. Many of them were unable or unwilling to return. They settled in Britain, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, scattered across the diaspora, building lives in foreign countries, with foreign languages, carrying with them the peculiar burden of exiles, which is the knowledge that the home you are mourning no longer exists in the form you are mourning it. In this context, Wojtek became something more than a mascot. He became a memory around which all the other memories could organize themselves, a fixed point in the shifting, painful geography of what they had lost and what they had held on to. When veterans of the Polish Second Corps met in the years after the war, the stories they told included Wojtek, the way family stories always include the family dog or the family cat, as a character who appears at key moments, whose reactions to events provide a kind of emotional annotation, whose presence is the proof that the warmth was real, that the laughter was real, that the love was real. After the German surrender, in May 1945, the question of Wojtek's future became suddenly and practically urgent. The Polish Second Corps was being demobilized, the men were being dispersed, and Wojtek, Private Wojtek, serial number and all, veteran of Monte Cassino and the Italian campaign, needed somewhere to go. The answer was the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland, where a number of the demobilized Polish soldiers had settled in the surrounding area. Edinburgh had a substantial Polish community by the late 1940s, men who had come for the war and stayed, who had put down roots in the grey northern city with its castle and its cold rain and its particular brand of reserved hospitality. The zoo accepted Wojtek. He arrived in 1947 and lived there until his death in December 1963, when he was approximately 22 years old. A good long life for a bear, and longer than many of the men he had served with had survived the war. The visitors to the zoo over those 16 years saw an unusual animal, a very large Syrian brown bear who did not behave quite like other bears. He was calm around people in a way that was slightly disconcerting, as if he were the one choosing to tolerate their presence rather than the other way around. He understood Polish and would turn and sometimes respond to sentences spoken in the language of his soldiers. He would, when addressed by former comrades, exhibit a recognition that was unmistakable, the lifted head, the slightly different quality of attention, the way he oriented his body toward a familiar voice across years of silence. The veterans came to see him. This is the part of the story that does not come with official documentation, but that was witnessed by enough people to be beyond reasonable doubt. Old men in civilian clothes, with the particular bearing that military service permanently imposes on a body, would stand at the bear enclosure in Edinburgh Zoo and speak to the animal in Polish. They would throw cigarettes to him, gently, not to taunt, but to share, the way you share something with a friend. They would tell him things, quietly, the kind of things you tell someone who has been through what you have been through, who carries the same memories, who does not require explanation. The zoo visitors around them must have found this behavior puzzling or moving, or both. An old man talking to a bear, the bear listening or seeming to listen. The gap between them that was also somehow not a gap at all. What those men were doing, standing at that railing, was what human beings have always done with the dead and with the absent. They were maintaining the relationship. They were refusing to let the bond be concluded by circumstance or by time, or by the ordinary indifference of the world. They were telling Wojtek that he was remembered, that what he had done had mattered, that the unit still existed, even if it existed only in the minds and hearts of those who had been part of it. And if the bear understood any of this, in whatever way a bear understands the things that happen to it, it was not nothing. It was, by some measures, everything. There is a statue of Wojtek now in Edinburgh, near the western entrance to Princes Street Gardens, at the foot of the Castle Rock. It was unveiled in 2015, sculpted by Alan Herriot, and it shows the bear and a Polish soldier together. The bear upright on his haunches, the soldier beside him, their postures suggesting not the hierarchy of animal and keeper, but the equality of comrades. Edinburgh also has a memorial to Wojtek in the city's museum on the history of the Polish contribution to the Second World War. There is a Wojtek in the Imperial War Museum. There are Wojteks in Poland, which recovered its independence and its identity after decades, as Anders's soldiers always believed it would, and which now commemorates its wartime soldiers with the particular intensity of a nation that knows what it means to have nearly been extinguished. The story has never entirely faded, not the way stories of individual humans fade, because the human mind processes animals differently, keeps them in a separate category where sentiment is less guarded and access is easier. You can argue about the military significance of a bear carrying shells on a hillside in Italy in 1944. You can discuss whether his calmness was training or bond or simple behavioral habituation. You can be as clinical as you like about the practical utility of a 300-pound ursine volunteer in the logistics chain of the Allied advance. None of that changes what the Polish soldiers of the Second Corps knew, which was this: he chose to stay. He chose them. In a war built entirely on systems of compulsion, conscription, command, ideology, threat, the grinding machinery of national and imperial will that had consumed millions of people who never had a moment's choice about any of it. A bear had made a free decision. He had looked at the situation, and he had picked his side, and he had never changed his mind. Think about what that means to men who had been given no choice at all. Men who had been arrested in the middle of the night, men who had been marched at gunpoint onto cattle cars, men who had survived conditions designed to kill them, not because they were soldiers or enemies, but simply because they happened to be Polish, and therefore, in the political calculus of the time, expendable. These men, who had been denied agency in everything, denied the choice of where to live, where to work, whether to eat, whether to see their families again, had been chosen by a bear. Freely, obviously, unmistakably. He had watched them and decided that they were worth staying with. He had weighed, in whatever way a bear weighs things, the terror of the explosions against the pull of their presence, and the pull of their presence had won. It is hard to think of a more precise or more unexpected form of validation. The world had tried very hard to tell these men that they did not matter. The bear had told them otherwise, and animals, unlike humans, do not lie about that. They cannot. They have no politics, no diplomacy, no strategic interest in making you feel better about yourself. When a bear decides to stay on a battlefield for you, it is the purest form of testimony that exists. This is why the story of Wojtek has lasted. Not because it is militarily interesting, although it is. Not because it is historically unusual, although it certainly is. It has lasted because it is a story about what happens when the fundamental human need for connection and meaning and belonging is stripped of everything artificial. Every institution, every nation, every system of reward and punishment that normally mediates and manages and controls these needs, and encounters something that responds to them directly, without any of those mediating systems, simply and honestly and completely. The Polish soldiers needed something to love. They needed something that would love them back without conditions. They needed proof that tenderness was still possible, that the world had not been entirely converted by the years of horror into a place where only power and cruelty and mere survival were real. They found that thing in a bear cub that someone sold them for a tin of meat in an Iranian mountain pass. And the bear grew, and the war went on, and the battle was fought, and history moved on as history always does, leaving wreckage and memory and monuments in its wake. But the memory that lodged deepest in the men who were there was not the victory. It was the bear walking calmly forward with the shells, through the smoke and the thunder, toward the guns. It was the choice he made, freely and without drama, in the worst moment of the worst battle of their lives. It was the fact that he stayed. If you have found yourself moved by this story, and I suspect that if you have watched this far, you have, I want to ask you to hold on to that feeling for a moment before you move on. Not because I want to turn a historical account into something sentimental, but because I think the feeling you are having is important. It is pointing at something true. The world is full, right now, of systems and structures and narratives that are trying to tell you who matters and who doesn't, what counts and what doesn't, whose sacrifice is worth remembering and whose isn't. These stories are being told with enormous resources and enormous sophistication. They are often very convincing. And one of the things that can cut through them, one of the things that has always cut through them, is an honest, direct, unchosen act of loyalty. Wojtek didn't know anything about the politics. He didn't know about the Gulag or the Yalta Conference or the betrayal of Polish sovereignty or the strategic importance of Monte Cassino in the Allied advance up the Italian boot. He knew his people. He knew they needed something from him. He knew how to give it. That's a kind of wisdom that does not require any formal education or any philosophical framework. It just requires paying attention and caring enough to act on what you see. The question that this story leaves me with is not a historical one. It is, who are your people and what do you do when they need you? I think you know the answer. I think Wojtek, if he could have put it into words, would have said, you stay, you carry what needs to be carried, you walk forward. The smoke and the noise are real, but so is the love, and the love is louder. Drop a comment below if this story hit you the way it hit me. And if you believe that the forgotten stories of ordinary courage deserve to be remembered, if you think that the men who came back from the Gulag and walked into that battle deserve a place in the conversation that history is still having, then the one thing I can ask you to do is share this. Not for me, for them, for Wojtek, for the idea that loyalty, freely chosen in the worst possible circumstances, is among the most extraordinary things in the world, because it is, because it was, because it always will be.